It was supposed to be just another quiet Monday morning at the Whitmore estate, the grand mansion nestled on the outskirts of Charleston, South Carolina. The sun poured through the towering windows, casting long beams across marble floors and antique rugs. In the heart of the estate, life moved at a graceful, almost sleepy pace. Amelia Carter, 23 years old and newly hired as a housekeeper, gripped her schedule nervously as she made her way through the endless corridor. She had only arrived 2 days earlier, still memorizing the labyrinth of hallways, staircases, and private rooms. Everything about the Whitmore estate screamed luxury and formality, a world far removed from the modest apartment she had shared with her grandmother back in Savannah. She wore the simple uniform given to her on arrival, her auburn hair pinned neatly under a cap, her sneakers silent against the polished floors. Amelia was determined to do well. This job paid more than anything she had ever held before, and she needed it desperately to cover her grandmother's mounting medical bills. That morning, her supervisor, Mrs. Langley, had instructed her to dust the east wing, the part of the mansion where no guests were staying. Amelia clutched the cleaning supplies to her chest, glancing left and right, counting doors as Mrs. Langley had shown her. She stopped at room 208, checked her list, and, seeing the number matched, twisted the handle gently. Inside, the room was flooded with the golden glow of morning light. Heavy velvet drapes were pulled back to reveal a sprawling bedroom decorated in navy blue and cream. Amelia stepped in, cautious, and immediately heard it. The soft splash of water. Her stomach dropped. Before she could react, she caught a glimpse through the slightly ajar bathroom door. A man stood under the cascade of a massive rainfall shower, water glistening on tan skin and strong muscles. His back was turned, unaware of her presence. Steam curled in the air, making the moment feel even more surreal. Panic gripped her. Amelia's heart leapt into her throat as she stumbled backward, nearly dropping her supplies. In her rush, her foot caught the edge of a rug and she tumbled hard onto the marble floor with a loud thud. The noise was enough. The man in the shower turned sharply, instinctively grabbing a towel and wrapping it around his waist. He stepped out of the bathroom, his dark brown hair dripping, his jaw clenched, his intense gray eyes locked onto her frozen form. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low but commanding. Amelia scrambled to her feet, mortified. She could barely find her voice. "I am so sorry," she stammered, her cheeks flaming. "I thought this room was empty. I am new. I must have made a mistake." The man narrowed his eyes at her, studying her flushed face and trembling hands. There was a heavy pause, thick with tension and embarrassment. "You should leave," he said finally, his tone clipped. "Now." Without another word, Amelia bolted from the room, clutching her cleaning supplies like a shield. Her sneakers squeaked on the floor as she fled down the hallway, humiliation burning in every fiber of her being. What she did not realize was that the man she had just walked in on was none other than Nathaniel Whitmore himself, heir to the Whitmore fortune, CEO of Whitmore Industries, and the owner of everything around her. Nathaniel stood motionless for a long time after she left, water still dripping from his hair onto the marble floor. He stared at the door where she had vanished, a frown creasing his brow. Something about her lingered in his mind. Something about the honesty in her wide green eyes. But Nathaniel Whitmore had no time for distractions, especially not from a maid. At least, that was what he told himself. He had no idea just how much this accidental encounter would change both of their lives forever. Amelia fled to the back service wing, her heart hammering in her chest. She ducked into the laundry room, a small warm space that smelled of detergent and fresh linen. Leaning against a counter, she pressed a hand over her mouth, trying to steady her breathing. What had she done? She had only been here 2 days, and now she had probably ruined everything. The rules had been clear. Staff must not disturb the residents. Staff must never enter a room without double-checking. Staff must be invisible. And she had just barged into the owner's private suite. Mrs. Langley was going to fire her, she was sure of it. Tears pricked her eyes, but she blinked them back. Amelia Carter did not cry. She could not afford to cry. Meanwhile, on the other side of the estate, Nathaniel Whitmore pulled on a fresh shirt and trousers, running a hand through his damp hair. His mind should have been on his meeting with the board of directors in an hour. Instead, he kept seeing those wide green eyes, that look of sheer panic on the girl's face. He was not used to staff making mistakes. The Whitmore estate was run with military precision, and yet something about the girl stayed with him. She had been young, frightened, but there had been no malice in her expression, only genuine terror and mortification. Nathaniel checked his watch. He had no time for distractions. Still, before heading to his office downtown, he made a mental note to ask Mrs. Langley about the new housekeeper. Down in the kitchen, Amelia tried to compose herself. She focused on scrubbing dishes, on wiping counters, on anything that kept her hands busy and her mind from spiraling into panic. Hours passed. She stayed out of sight, sticking to back hallways and the service stairs. Every time she heard footsteps approaching, she ducked away like a ghost. At lunch, Mrs. Langley cornered her by the pantry. "Miss Cotta," she said sharply. "A word." Amelia swallowed hard and followed her into the narrow hallway behind the kitchen. Mrs. Langley folded her arms across her chest, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Whitmore asked about you," she said after a moment. "Asked your name, your position." Amelia's heart dropped into her stomach. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "It was an accident. I will pack my things. I understand." Mrs. Langley stared at her for a long moment. Then, to Amelia's shock, her stern face softened slightly. "You are not fired," she said. "Mr. Whitmore said nothing about dismissal, only that you are to be more careful." Amelia sagged against the wall in relief. "But," Mrs. Langley continued, her voice regaining its usual briskness, "you will work doubly hard to prove you belong here. No more mistakes, Miss Carter, not one." "Yes, ma'am," Amelia breathed. "I will not let you down." Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the estate's sprawling gardens, Amelia found herself assigned to the library, dusting the endless shelves of ancient books. She moved quietly among the leather-bound volumes, the scent of old paper and polished wood filling the air. Her mind wandered, replaying the morning's disaster. She still could not believe she had seen him like that. Mr. Whitmore. The Nathaniel Whitmore. She had heard whispers from the other maids about how he had taken over the company at 27, about how he had doubled its worth in just a few years, about how he kept to himself, rarely seen at social events, preferring to work and live in solitude. No wonder he had been so furious. A rustle behind her broke her thoughts. Amelia turned sharply, expecting Mrs. Langley or another staff member. Instead, there he was. Nathaniel Whitmore himself stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his jacket draped casually over one shoulder. Her breath caught. For a moment, neither of them moved. The world narrowed to the space between them, thick with unspoken tension. "You are the new housekeeper," Nathaniel said at last, his voice low and even. "Yes, sir," Amelia managed to reply, her voice barely a whisper. He studied her for a long moment, and Amelia felt as if he could see right through her, see every secret, every fear, every dream she tried to hide. "You are doing fine," he said finally. "Do not let today shake you." Amelia blinked, not trusting her ears. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice trembling. Nathaniel gave a slight nod, then disappeared as silently as he had come. Amelia stood frozen for a long time after he left, her heart pounding wildly. She had survived the day, somehow. What she did not know was that this was only the beginning. Their paths were about to cross again, in ways neither of them could have predicted. The next morning, Amelia rose before dawn, her nerves still buzzing from the encounter in the library. She smoothed down her simple uniform, pinned her hair neatly, and set to work before most of the estate even stirred. The kitchen was her safe space, a place where the clatter of pans and the rhythm of breakfast preparation could drown out anxious thoughts. Yet even there, she could not escape him. Mrs. Langley entered briskly around 7, a clipboard in hand. She barked out the day's assignments, her sharp eyes lingering a fraction longer than usual when she came to Amelia's name. "You are to assist Mr. Whitmore directly this morning," she said. Amelia froze, her hands stilling over a bowl of flour. "Assist him?" she echoed. Mrs. Langley nodded curtly. "He requested help organizing the private study. Apparently, he finds the dust intolerable." Amelia swallowed hard. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. She barely tasted the small breakfast she managed to eat. Every step up the grand staircase felt heavier than the last. She carried her cleaning supplies like a shield, wishing she could simply vanish into the polished walls. Outside the double doors of the study, she paused, took a deep breath, knocked softly. "Enter," came the voice from within. Amelia stepped inside. The study was vast, all dark wood and heavy leather, the scent of old books and subtle cologne lingering in the air. Nathaniel sat behind a massive mahogany desk, a laptop open in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his hazel eyes sharp yet unreadable. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice low and steady. "Come in." Amelia moved toward the shelves along the far wall, keeping her gaze down, focusing on her task. Dusting, wiping, organizing. She moved quickly and quietly, trying to make herself invisible, but she could feel his eyes on her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, in a way that made her skin tingle, her heart race faster. Minutes stretched into an hour. The silence between them grew thick, heavy with things neither dared to say. Finally, Nathaniel closed his laptop with a soft click and leaned back in his chair. "You are not like the others," he said suddenly. Amelia almost dropped her cloth. She turned slowly to face him, her heart in her throat. "Sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, a ghost of a smile that softened his otherwise severe face. "You are not polished," he said thoughtfully. "You do not move like someone pretending to belong." Amelia flushed, unsure whether it was a compliment or a criticism. I am sorry if I do not meet the standards," she said quickly, her hands twisting in the hem of her apron. Nathaniel rose from his chair, moving closer. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gaze never wavering from hers. "You misunderstand," he said. "It is not a flaw. It is refreshing." Amelia stared at him, utterly lost for words. No one had ever spoken to her like this. Not a boss, not a man. "You are real," Nathaniel said simply. "In a world full of people wearing masks, you are not afraid to show the struggle." Amelia's throat tightened painfully. She looked down, blinking rapidly. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. He watched her for another long moment, then stepped back, giving her space. "You may finish for today," he said, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. "Mrs. Langley will find you another task." Amelia bobbed a quick curtsy and fled, her heart hammering against her ribs. In the corridor, she leaned against the cool stone wall, trying to steady her breathing. Why was he being kind to her? She was nobody, just a maid, a poor girl from nowhere. Yet somehow she had caught the attention of a man like Nathaniel Whitmore. The idea should have terrified her. Instead, it warmed some fragile place inside her that had long been frozen. What Amelia did not realize was that she had already changed something in him, too. Nathaniel stood alone in the study after she left, staring out the wide windows toward the misty gardens beyond. He had been alone for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to notice someone, to want to know them. And against every instinct, every rule he had set for himself, Nathaniel realized he wanted to see more of her. He wanted to understand the story behind those wide green eyes, even if it meant stepping outside the walls he had built around his heart, even if it meant risking everything he thought he knew about himself. The following days unfolded in a strange new rhythm. Amelia tried to slip back into the background, to become invisible once again, but the quiet current that had sparked between her and Nathaniel refused to fade. It lingered in the air whenever she passed him in the halls, in the brief, almost imperceptible moments when their eyes met across the wide spaces of Whitmore Manor. Amelia noticed how Miss Langley seemed to watch her more closely now, how the other staff whispered a little more often when she walked into a room. She knew how dangerous attention could be, especially attention from someone like Nathaniel Whitmore. Still, there were moments she could not avoid him. Little accidents that felt somehow less than accidental. One afternoon, while dusting the grand piano in the music room, she dropped her cloth and bent to retrieve it, only to find Nathaniel standing silently in the doorway, a file in his hand. He made no move to speak, merely watching her with a look that made her cheeks flame. Another time she stumbled coming down the back stairs, her hands full of linen, and he appeared as if from nowhere, steadying her with a firm hand on her elbow. Their eyes locked, breathless and close, and Amelia thought for a heartbeat that he might say something reckless and impossible, but he merely released her gently and walked away without a word, leaving her standing there with her heart in her throat. These encounters became the silent rhythm of her days, moments stitched together by a tension she could neither explain nor escape. She told herself it was foolish, dangerous. She reminded herself of her place, of the vast distance that lay between their worlds, and yet, despite all her better judgment, something fragile and persistent bloomed in her chest whenever she thought of him. One rainy evening, as the staff finished their duties and the manor grew quiet, Amelia found herself in the small side garden, seeking a moment of peace. The rain had stopped, leaving the world silvered and fresh, the scent of wet earth rising around her. She wandered along the narrow path, brushing her fingertips lightly over the blooming lavender, trying to quiet her restless mind. She did not hear him approach until he was close. She turned, startled, to find Nathaniel standing a few feet away, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his dark trousers. He looked almost ordinary in that moment, without the layers of formality and expectation that usually cloaked him. For a long moment they simply looked at each other, the misty air crackling with things unsaid. "I did not expect to find anyone else out here," he said finally, his voice low and calm. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. "I needed some air," she said, her voice small. "It gets heavy inside." He nodded, as if he understood more than she had intended to reveal. Silence stretched between them again, but this time it felt less like a wall and more like a bridge, fragile but real. Nathaniel took a slow step closer. "You remind me," he said softly, "that there is more to life than board meetings and contracts." Amelia blinked, unsure how to respond. She felt both exposed and seen in a way that unsettled her deeply. "I do not know anything about those things," she said, forcing a small smile. "I am just a maid." His eyes darkened, and he shook his head slowly. "You are not just anything, Amelia." Hearing her name on his lips was like a warm hand pressed against her spine. She lowered her gaze, flustered, and he took another step toward her, close enough now that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the vulnerability he so rarely showed. "You should not speak to me like this," she whispered, though her voice held no real resistance. "Well, not?" he asked, almost gently. "Because it is dangerous," she said, lifting her eyes to meet his. "For you? For me?" He smiled then, a sad, crooked thing that made her chest ache. "Some things are worth the risk," he said, and before she could think, before she could breathe, Nathaniel lifted his hand and brushed a raindrop from her cheek with a touch so tender it nearly undid her. Amelia stood frozen, the world narrowing to the space between them, the steady beat of her heart loud in her ears. For a fleeting, reckless moment, she wanted to lean into him, to let herself believe in the impossible. But reality crashed back in like a wave. She stepped back, the loss of his touch like a sudden winter. "Good night, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice shaking. Without waiting for his reply, she turned and fled into the shadows of the manor, leaving Nathaniel standing alone in the garden, watching her disappear. He did not call after her. He simply stood there, feeling, for the first time in years, that he had something to lose. The next morning, Amelia moved through the manor as if walking through a dream she could not wake from. Her hands performed their tasks on instinct, dusting and polishing, but her mind refused to stay anchored to the present. It kept drifting back to the garden, to the way Nathaniel had looked at her, to the warmth of his touch against her skin. She cursed herself for her foolishness. It was a dangerous path, and she knew it, yet some part of her clung to that fleeting moment, as if it were a secret too precious to abandon. The staff, keen-eyed and quick to gossip, sensed the change, even if they could not name it. Mrs. Langley watched Amelia with thinly veiled suspicion, her sharp gaze lingering a little too long. Amelia kept her head down, avoiding the conversations that buzzed in the corners of the kitchen and servants' hall. She could not afford to give them any reason to talk. Yet fate seemed determined to tangle her closer to Nathaniel, whether she wished it or not. He sought her out with small tasks that could have easily been handled by anyone else. Requests to find a misplaced file, to retrieve a particular book from the library, to bring fresh coffee to the study. Each encounter chipped away at the distance she fought to maintain. That afternoon, while delivering a stack of papers to his office, she found him seated behind the massive oak desk, his head bent over a folder. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment the air between them thickened, charged with the memory of the night before. She set the papers down carefully, keeping her gaze fixed on the desk. "Thank you, Amelia," he said, his voice softer than it needed to be. She nodded, turning quickly to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Stay a moment," he said. "Please." Against her better judgment, she obeyed, standing stiffly just inside the room. Nathaniel rose from his chair and crossed the space between them with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the tiny crease between his brows. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "For last night?" Amelia shook her head, words tumbling out before she could think. "You did nothing wrong, sir." His lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. Perhaps not in action, but in thought. He trailed off, the admission hanging heavily between them. Amelia clutched the hem of her apron, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. "I cannot be what you want," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Even if I wanted to. I cannot fit into your world." Nathaniel stepped closer, his hand lifting as if to touch her, then falling back to his side. "You do not have to fit into anything," he said. "I am tired of a world where everything is about appearances, about expectations." He laughed, a bitter sound. "Do you know what it is like, Amelia, to have every moment of your life scripted before you are even born?" She shook her head, too stunned to speak. "I envied you," he said, and she blinked in disbelief. "Your freedom, your honesty, your courage to live, even when life has been so cruel to you." Tears pricked her eyes, unbidden and unwelcome. She hated the way he saw through her defenses, hated and craved it in equal measure. "It is not freedom," she whispered. "It is survival." Nathaniel reached out then, his fingers brushing hers, the touch feather-light but burning. "Then let me survive with you," he said. "Let me choose something real." A soft knock at the door shattered the moment. Amelia jerked her hand away, stepping back just as Mrs. Langley poked her head inside. Her sharp eyes flicked from Amelia to Nathaniel, suspicion sharpening her features. "Pardon me, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her tone clipped. "There is a call for you." Nathaniel nodded, his expression closing off. "Thank you, Mrs. Langley. Amelia was just leaving." The words, spoken with polite detachment, sliced deeper than any cruelty could have. Amelia curtsied stiffly and fled the office, her cheeks burning. In the corridor, she pressed her back against the wall, willing herself not to cry. She had been foolish to believe, even for a second, that anything real could exist between them. She was a maid. He was her master. And no stolen moments in rain-soaked gardens or whispered promises could change that brutal truth. Amelia threw herself into work with a fervor that bordered on desperation. She scrubbed floors that already gleamed, polished silver that shone like mirrors, folded laundry with such precision that even the sternest housekeeper could find no fault. Anything to keep her mind from wandering back to Nathaniel, to the softness in his voice, to the way he had almost touched her hand. She berated herself for her weakness, for the way her heart ached at the memory he had dismissed her easily enough when Mrs. Langley had interrupted. Whatever foolish ideas she had harbored about there being something genuine between them had been crushed beneath the heavy weight of reality. She told herself to forget, to move on, to bury the night in the garden so deep it could never surface again. But forgetting was not so simple. Nathaniel haunted the manor like a ghost, his presence lingering in the halls, his voice echoing down corridors. Every time she rounded a corner or opened a door, she half expected to find him standing there, watching her with those piercing hazel eyes. Days passed in a blur of toil and sleepless night. The first snowfall of winter came early that year, dusting the city in a soft blanket of white. Inside the manor, preparations for the annual Whitmore Winter Gala were underway, a grand affair attended by the city's most influential families. Amelia had heard the whispers among the staff, important business allies, political figures, and Nathaniel's prospective fiancée, the daughter of a prominent senator, a woman of impeccable breeding and endless charm. The announcement, it was said, would be made at the gala. Amelia kept her head down, forcing herself not to listen, not to care. What did it matter to her whom Nathaniel chose to marry? He had been born into a world she could never touch. She was a passing shadow in his grand life, a fleeting mistake he would soon forget. On the morning of the gala, the manor buzzed with frantic energy. Amelia spent hours helping decorate the grand ballroom, her hands raw from tying endless ribbons and polishing the marble floors until they gleamed like ice. As the hour drew near, Mrs. Langley summoned all available staff for final instructions. Amelia was assigned to the upper gallery, tasked with keeping the refreshments stocked and out of sight unless called for. She was grateful for the distance, for the chance to remain a mere shadow at the edge of his world. As evening fell, the guests arrived in glittering waves of silk and velvet, their laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses filling the air. From her perch, Amelia watched as Nathaniel moved through the crowd with effortless grace, his black tuxedo perfectly tailored, his hair neatly styled. Beside him stood the senator's daughter, Clarissa Monroe, radiant in a gown of deep sapphire that caught the light with every movement. They made a striking pair, the perfect image of power and privilege. Amelia's chest tightened painfully as she watched them. Clarissa laughed at something Nathaniel said, her hand brushing his arm in a gesture of easy intimacy. He smiled politely, but there was a distance in his eyes, a hollowness to his laughter that only someone who had once seen him unguarded could recognize. Amelia turned away, unable to watch any longer. She retreated to the servants' corridor, leaning against the cold stone wall, fighting the tears that threatened to fall. Foolish to ever believe he could see her as anything more than a mistake. She was gathering her composure when a soft voice behind her said her name. She spun around to find Nathaniel standing there, alone, his face shadowed in the dim light. "Amelia," he said, his voice rough, as if he had been searching for her for a long time. She took a step back, her heart slamming against her ribs. "You should not be here," she whispered. "You have guests to entertain." "A life to attend to," he stepped closer, his hands fisting at his sides. "I do not want any of it," he said fiercely. "Not without you." She shook her head, tears burning her eyes. "You do not mean that, not really. You will regret it tomorrow, when she is on your arm and I am just a servant you once pitied." Nathaniel reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently cupped her cheek. "I will never regret you," he said. "Not one second, not one glance, not one breath I have shared in your presence." Amelia closed her eyes, torn between the aching need to believe him and the bitter voice of reason that warned her not to fall. "Please," he whispered, Give me a chance to prove it." The walls around her heart cracked, just a little, under the weight of his plea. She opened her eyes, finding only honesty and longing in his gaze. Slowly, fearfully, she nodded. A single nod that changed everything. Nathaniel took Amelia's hand, threading his fingers through hers as if afraid she would vanish if he let go. For a moment they stood there in the dim corridor, two souls suspended between worlds, between caution and hope. In the distance, music swelled from the ballroom, the strains of a waltz floating through the manor, but it felt like another life, a life they no longer belonged to. Without a word, he led her through the servants' passageways, away from the laughter and polished surfaces, into the older parts of the house where few guests ever ventured. They entered the abandoned library, a forgotten room thick with the scent of old leather and dust, lit only by the soft glow of the moon through tall windows. Here time seemed to pause, and the noise of the gala faded into silence. Amelia tugged her hand from his grasp, wrapping her arms around herself as if trying to shield her heart from further hurt. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice trembling, "this is madness. You cannot just walk away from everything for someone like me." He stepped closer, the moonlight catching in his eyes, fierce and bright. "I am not walking away from everything. I am walking toward what matters." She shook her head, her heart breaking under the weight of it all. "You barely know me." Nathaniel smiled, a small, aching smile that made her chest tighten. "I know enough. I know the sound of your laughter when you think no one is listening. I know how you hum when you polish the silver. I know the kindness in your hands when you care for others. And I know that since the moment I first heard your voice, nothing else has felt right without you in it." Tears blurred her vision, and she turned away, unable to bear the tenderness in his words. She had dreamed of being seen, of being loved for who she was, but never had she believed it possible. And yet here he was, stripping away every defense she had built. "You deserve someone who can stand beside you without shame," she whispered. Nathaniel stepped behind her, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "I deserve someone who makes me feel alive," he said. "And that person is you, Amelia." She closed her eyes, feeling the heat of his touch seep through the thin fabric of her dress, melting the last of her resistance. Slowly she turned to face him, and he cupped her face in his hands, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Say you believe me," he murmured, his forehead resting against her. "Say you will give us a chance." Her heart, battered and bruised, whispered yes before her mind could object. She nodded, and the next breath his lips found hers. The kiss was soft at first, a tentative question, but when she responded it deepened, fierce and desperate, as if they were both trying to erase all the pain that had come before. Amelia clutched at his jacket, anchoring herself to him, while his arms wrapped around her, pulling her against the solid warmth of his body. When they finally broke apart, they stood there, breathing hard, foreheads pressed together, the taste of each other still lingering between them. "Come away with me," Nathaniel whispered. "Tonight, now, we will leave this house, this city, this life behind. We will make our own future." Amelia's breath caught. She wanted it more than anything she had ever wanted, but fear still clung to her like a second skin. "What about your family? Your company?" she asked. He smiled again, that beautiful, reckless smile. "Let them think what they will. I would rather lose everything than lose you." She laughed through her tears, the sound light and trembling. "You are a fool," she said. He grinned, brushing a kiss against her forehead. "Only for you." She hesitated for a heartbeat longer, the weight of all her doubts pressing down on her. But then she looked into his eyes and saw not a CO, not a man of wealth and power, but the boy she had glimpsed that night in the garden. Vulnerable and real, and she realized that she had already fallen. There was no going back. "Yes," she whispered, the words slipping from her lips like a prayer. "Take me with you." Nathaniel kissed her again, a promise sealed in the quiet shadows of the forgotten library. They slipped out of the manor unseen, hand in hand, into the crisp winter night. The city stretched out before them, full of uncertainty, full of risk, but also full of possibility. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs and the hope in their hearts, and somehow it was enough. They found refuge in a small inn on the edge of the city, far from the glittering world Nathaniel once ruled, and the shadows Amelia had tried so hard to escape. The room was modest, with creaky floorboards and threadbare curtains, but to them it felt like a sanctuary, a place untouched by expectations or judgment. Nathaniel sat on the bed, tugging off his tie with a sigh, while Amelia stood by the window, staring out at the unfamiliar streets below. The silence between them was not heavy, but filled with the tentative breath of a new beginning. "Do you think we can really do this?" she asked, without turning. Nathaniel leaned back on his elbows, watching her with a soft smile. "I think we already are." Amelia hugged herself, feeling the enormity of what they had done crash over her. She had walked away from everything she knew, thrown herself into the unknown with nothing but the faith she had placed in a man she had only just begun to truly know. And yet, when she thought of returning to that life of servitude and invisibility, she knew she had made the only choice her heart could live with. Nathaniel patted the bed beside him. "Come here," he said gently. She hesitated for only a second before crossing the room and sinking down next to him. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together, grounding her. "I know this is terrifying," he said, his voice low. "I am scared too, but I have spent my whole life chasing things that do not matter. Money, power, approval, none of it ever made me feel the way I feel when I look at you." Tears pricked her eyes, and she ducked her head, overcome by the sincerity in his voice. "You barely know me," she whispered. Nathaniel lifted her chin with 2 fingers, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I know enough," he said simply, "and the rest we will discover together." They stayed like that for a long moment, the city humming quietly outside, the world narrowing down to the heat of his hand in her, the steady beat of his heart under her palm. Eventually, exhaustion pulled them under, and they curled up together on the narrow bed, finding comfort in each other's arms. Morning came harsh and fast. Nathaniel's phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, a reminder that the world they had left behind was not so easily escaped. He ignored it at first, wanting to hold onto the fragile piece of their little bubble, but when it buzzed again, Amelia stirred, her brow furrowing in her sleep. With a resigned sigh, he answered. "Nathaniel West, where in God's name are you?" barked a familiar voice. His uncle, Gregory West, the acting chairman of West Industries, sounded furious. Nathaniel kept his voice calm. "I am taking some time away." "Time away? You missed the gala? The board is in uproar, and there are rumors, Nathaniel, ugly ones, about you running off with a maid." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Amelia is not just a maid," he said coldly. "She is the only real thing in my life." Gregory scoffed. "You have responsibilities, a legacy. You cannot throw it all away for a fling." Nathaniel's hand curled into a fist. "It is not a fling. It is my life, my choice." Gregory's voice dropped into a menacing growl. "If you do not return immediately, the board will move to remove you. You will lose everything." Nathaniel's gaze drifted to Amelia, who was stirring awake, her sleepy eyes finding his with a worried frown. He smiled at her, a quiet reassurance blooming on his lips. "Then let them," he said, and hung up. Amelia sat up, rubbing her eyes. "Is everything okay?" He slid the phone onto the nightstand and pulled her into his arms. "Everything is exactly as it should be," he murmured against her hair. But the words felt hollow. The world was already closing in, the forces that had shaped his life moving against him. They spent the day holed up in the inn, talking in hushed voices about dreams and fears, about what kind of life they could build together. Nathaniel promised her a home filled with laughter, not silence. He spoke of building something new, something just for them. Amelia spoke of Owen, her younger brother, still back at the estate, still depending on her. She worried about him, about the life she had abandoned. Nathaniel listened, holding her hands between his, and vowed they would bring Owen to live with them. That family was not something they would ever turn their backs on. Night fell again, and with it came a sense of fragile hope. But as they lay curled together under the thin blanket, Nathaniel knew the battle was only beginning. Love was not always enough to shield them from the world's judgment. They would have to fight for this, for each other, and he was willing. Because loving Amelia was the only thing that had ever felt real. He pressed a kiss to her hair and whispered into the darkness, "Whatever comes, I will choose you. Always." Morning dawned cold and gray, the sky outside their window a sheet of steel. Nathaniel rose early, leaving Amelia asleep for a few precious hours more. He stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, studying the man who had once been groomed for empire and now stood ready to forsake it all for love. His jaw was set, his eyes hard with determination. When Amelia woke, she found him seated at the tiny kitchen table, a cup of coffee cooling at his elbow, a stack of papers spread before him. "What is all that?" she asked, patting over in her bare feet. Nathaniel smiled, the sight of her in his worn t-shirt stealing the breath from his chest. "Options," he said simply. She sat down across from him, drawing her knees up to her chest. "Options for what?" He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "For our future. I am selling my shares in West Industries, walking away, starting fresh." Amelia's mouth fell open. "Nathaniel, you cannot." "I can," he said, his thumb stroking her knuckles. "And I will. I have enough investments to keep us comfortable. We will build something together, something that belongs to us and no one else." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, unwilling to weep when he was offering her the world. "You would give up everything for me?" He shook his head, his smile soft. "Not for you. For us. Because a life without you is not a life I want." Their moment was shattered by a loud knock at the door. Nathaniel stiffened, his instincts flaring. He rose and crossed to the door, peering through the peephole. Standing there, looking smug and self-satisfied, was Gregory West. Nathaniel opened the door a crack. "What do you want?" Gregory pushed inside, his expensive suit and polished shoes at odds with the shabby surroundings. He glanced around with a sneer. "Charming, really?" Amelia stood behind Nathaniel, wary but unbowed. Gregory's gaze raked over her, disdain plain on his face. "You are making a mistake," Gregory said, turning his attention back to Nathaniel. "The board has voted. If you walk away, you leave with nothing. No title, no influence. You will be just another nobody with a pretty girl on your arm." Nathaniel crossed his arms over his chest. "I do not care," Gregory snorted. "Of course you do. Men like us are not built for obscurity. You will come crawling back." Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice low and lethal. "You are wrong. I have already found everything I need." Gregory's eyes narrowed, realizing he had lost. "Do not say I did not warn you," he spat, before turning on his heel and storming out. The door slammed behind him, the sound reverberating through the tiny apartment. Amelia sagged against the table, her heart pounding. "He hates me," she said quietly. Nathaniel cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Let him fight them all. What we have is real, Amelia. It is worth more than any company, any fortune." She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I am scared," she admitted. "Me too," he whispered. "But being with you is the only thing that feels right." That night they sat on the rooftop of the inn, wrapped in a shared blanket, watching the stars fight to pierce the heavy clouds. Nathaniel spoke of dreams he had never dared voice before. A small house by the sea, a life of simple joys. A dog, maybe too. Children, if they were blessed. Amelia listened, her heart aching with love and fear, knowing that dreams so beautiful often came with a price. She turned to him, her voice steady. "If we do this, there is no turning back." Nathaniel smiled, brushing a kiss across her forehead. "I never wanted to turn back." In the weeks that followed, they built a new life, brick by fragile brick. Nathaniel sold his shares, shocking the business world. Articles ran in glossy magazines, headlines screaming about the heir who walked away for love. Amelia found work as an assistant in a small design firm, her days busy and full of laughter. They rented a cozy apartment overlooking a park, filled it with second-hand furniture and dreams. They lived simply, joyfully, fiercely, but love, they learned, was not a shield against hardship. There were nights when the money ran low, when doubt gnawed at their edges. There were fights, sharp and painful, born of fear more than anger. There were days when the past loomed too large, when Gregory's words echoed in Nathaniel's mind. And yet, through it all, they chose each other. Again and again. One evening, as they sat on their battered couch sharing a bowl of popcorn, Amelia turned to him, her smile soft. "Do you ever regret it?" Nathaniel kissed her hand, his eyes glowing. "Not for a second." She rested her head on his shoulder, content. "Neither do I." Outside, the city pulsed with life, 1,000 stories unfolding, but inside that tiny apartment, a different kind of magic lived, the kind built not on wealth or power, but on something far rarer, a love that had been tested by storms and still stood strong, a love that was, against all odds, enough. Spring arrived with shy blossoms and soft rains, the city shaking off its winter gloom as life renewed itself in every corner. Amelia and Nathaniel thrived in the rhythm they had built, a dance of quiet mornings and long walks, shared dreams and stubborn disagreements that always ended with laughter or kisses. They celebrated small victories, like when Amelia's boss praised her design ideas or when Nathaniel landed his first consulting contract, helping a struggling startup find its footing. It was not the life he had been born into, but it was real, and it was theirs. One Saturday afternoon, they wandered through a farmer's market, hand in hand, weaving between stalls bursting with colors and scents. Amelia paused at a booth selling handmade jewelry, her fingers tracing a delicate silver locket. Nathaniel watched her, his heart swelling with an emotion so fierce it almost frightened him. Later, as they picnicked in the park, he produced a tiny box from his jacket pocket, setting it wordlessly on the blanket between them. Amelia blinked, her breath catching. "Nathaniel!" He smiled, nerves dancing behind his calm facade. "Open it." Inside was the locket she had admired, and within it a tiny note, folded carefully. She unfolded it with trembling hands. It read simply, "Marry me." She looked up to find him on one knee, his eyes never leaving hers. "We have already chosen each other 100 times," he said softly. "Let us make it official. Let us keep choosing each other every day, for the rest of our lives." Tears blurred her vision as she nodded, laughing and crying all at once. "Yes," she whispered, throwing her arms around him. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They married in a small ceremony under a blooming archway in the park, surrounded by a handful of friends they had gathered along their journey. Amelia wore a simple dress of flowing ivory, her hair crowned with fresh flowers. Nathaniel wore a navy suit and a grin so wide it seemed to split the sky. There were no fancy venues, no celebrities, no reporters, just vows whispered through tears and laughter, promises etched in the deepest parts of their souls. Afterward, they danced, barefoot under the stars, their laughter mingling with the music of the night. Life after marriage was no fairy tale, and neither of them expected it to be. There were bills to pay, late nights spent worrying over bank balances, arguments over forgotten chores or missed dinners. But there was also a joy so steady and profound it anchored them through every storm. One rainy evening, as they huddled together on their couch with soup and blankets, Amelia turned to Nathaniel, her expression thoughtful. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The life you had before?" Nathaniel considered the question, his gaze distant for a moment, before it returned to her, clear and certain. "I miss the easy parts," he admitted, "the safety net, the freedom to be reckless without consequences, but none of it ever felt like living until you—" She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "You gave up everything for me." He shook his head, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I gained everything because of you." Their love was not built on grand gestures, but on the million tiny moments that stitched their hearts together. Coffee brewed just the way the other liked it, notes tucked into pockets on hard days, the simple act of reaching for each other in sleep, even in dreams. A year passed, and then another. Nathaniel's consulting work flourished, and Amelia's designs caught the attention of a boutique label, leading to a small but significant promotion. They moved into a slightly bigger apartment, one with a little balcony where Amelia grew herbs and Nathaniel read the paper on Sunday mornings. On a crisp autumn day, Amelia stood on that balcony, a letter trembling in her hand. It was from a prestigious gallery, accepting her proposal for a solo exhibition. She gasped, clutching the letter to her chest. "Nathaniel," she called, her voice breaking with excitement. He came running, worry flashing across his face until he saw her smile. "What is it?" She waved the letter, laughing and crying all at once. "They said yes." He lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a joyful circle as the leaves danced around them. That night, they sat together on the balcony, a bottle of cheap champagne between them, watching the city lights flicker like stars. "I am so proud of you," Nathaniel said, his voice thick with emotion. Amelia leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "We did this together," she said, "every step of the way." As the night deepened, Nathaniel took her hand, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring. "You once asked me if I regretted giving up everything," he murmured. "The truth is, I never gave up anything that mattered. I found my real fortune here, in this life with you." She smiled, tears shimmering in her eyes. "And I found my home," she whispered. They sat in silence, the city humming around them, their hearts beating in a rhythm only they could hear. It was not the life either of them had expected, but it was rich in ways that defied measure. And in that quiet, ordinary magic, they knew they had found something extraordinary. Not a fairy tale, not a dream, but a love that was real, resilient, and fiercely beautifully theirs. Always and forever. Years later, on a warm summer evening, Amelia and Nathaniel walked hand in hand through the same bustling farmer's market where once a locket had changed their lives. The air buzzed with life, the stalls overflowing with fresh fruit, wild flowers, and homemade crafts. Amelia's hair was streaked with silver now, but her eyes held the same fierce light Nathaniel had fallen for all those years ago. Nathaniel's temples were dusted with gray, but his hand still fit perfectly in hers, steady and sure. They paused by a stall selling jewelry, and Amelia smiled, tracing a familiar design among the pieces on display. A heart-shaped locket, delicate and simple, caught her eye. Nathaniel noticed and chuckled softly. "Thinking about the old days?" he asked. She nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. "Everything changed because of a locked door. A moment I never could have planned," she said. "I found my whole world in the most unexpected place." Nathaniel lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "Sometimes the best things in life happen when you least expect them," he whispered. "Like a stubborn maid walking into the wrong room," she teased, her eyes sparkling. "Like a stubborn CEO pretending not to need anyone," he countered, laughing. They walked a little further and found a small park bench shaded by a blooming tree. Sitting side by side, they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson. Nathaniel reached into his pocket and pulled out the original locket he had given her years ago. The metal was a little worn, but it gleamed in the fading light. "I kept it all this time," he said, "because no matter how many years pass, no matter how the world changes, Some things stay the same. Amelia opened the locket and found a tiny new note folded inside. She unfolded it with careful fingers and read the simple words, "Always and forever." Tears filled her eyes as she turned to him. "Always and forever," she echoed, her voice trembling. He pulled her close and they sat there as the evening settled around them, the world rushing by unnoticed. Love had not been a grand rescue or a perfect story without flaws. It had been messy and hard and breathtakingly beautiful. It had been a choice, made over and over again, through the years and the storms and the quiet mornings filled with coffee and laughter. Nathaniel brushed a strand of hair from her face and smiled, the same boyish grin that had once melted her defenses. "Thank you," he whispered, "for choosing me every day." Amelia leaned her forehead against his, her heart overflowing. "Thank you," she whispered back, "for teaching me that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones we never saw coming." The city lights began to twinkle around them, 1,000 tiny reminders that even in a world that moved too fast, there was still magic to be found. Not in wealth, not in titles, but in the simple, enduring power of two hearts that refused to give up on each other. And so they stayed, two souls bound by a love that had survived every test, every fear, every obstacle life could throw at them. Two hearts that had found, against all odds, their always and forever